You probably know that ever since it was first performed in the 1970s, George Carlin's 7 words you can never say on TV routine has been considered a stand-up comedy masterpiece.
Wouldn't you think it'd be normal if they didn't want you to say something to tell you what it is?
But you might not know that Carlin's bit kicked off a legal battle that is still taught in law schools to this very day. Today, we're going to take a look at how George Carlin's 7 dirty words routine caused a landmark Supreme Court decision. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel. After that, please leave a comment and let us know what other pop culture taboo-related topics you would like to hear about. Okay? Shit, pit, fuck, cock, motherfucker, and tits. Let's do this. The 1950s and early 1960s were relatively conservative times in America, even for comedians. Lenny Bruce, however, was a notable exception. As one of the first comics of the era to do obviously taboo material, Bruce was a hit in many quarters. However, he remained a controversial figure to much of the country, and he was arrested for public obscenity 5 times between 1961 and 1964. One of those arrests would change the course of a young George Carlin's career. Carlin originally presented himself with a wholesome, clean-cut image and a soft, family-friendly act. However, in 1962, Carlin was arrested alongside Lenny Bruce. While Carlin himself was only detained for not carrying an ID, the intrusive experience and the effect it had on Bruce's career left an impression. Years later, Carlin would also recall feeling like a traitor who was entertaining the fathers and mothers of the people he actually sympathized and associated with. Subsequently, he began to grow out his hair and beard, and his comedy became edgier and more socially conscious. He resolved to push boundaries, just like Lenny Bruce. George Carlin's famous 7 words you can never say on television routine was first developed and recorded in 1972.
And here's the list of words your dad and I don't ever want to hear you say.
Cursing was highly taboo, and the bit examined how it was possible simple words could be so harmful that audiences had to be protected from hearing them.
Boy, that's gonna save me an ass kicking or two.
Those words, pit, sucker, motherfucker, and tits. It was an instant success. Crowds loved to hear Carlin do the routine, and he would continue to refine and perform it for decades to come. In July of 1972, Carlin performed at Milwaukee's Summerfest. One of the routines he performed there was the 7 words monologue, and after completing it, he was arrested for obscenity. Carlin would eventually beat the charges in court, with a judge ruling his language was indecent but not illegal. In a masterful act of trolling, Carlin would temporarily rename the bit the Milwaukee 7. He would later find it funny that he was hassled over saying the 7 words when his whole intention in the first place was to free people from being hassled over saying the words.
They're just the words we can't say all the time.
While the trouble over the 7 words in Milwaukee may have passed, that wasn't the end of it. In 1973, John H. Douglas, a self-appointed media watchdog, heard the routine on the radio while he was driving his son home after visiting colleges. The station was WBAI, an affiliate of Pacifica Radio, and they had actually been airing the uncensored routine as part of an intellectual discussion about language taboos. Backed by his organization, Morality in Media, Douglas filed a complaint with the FCC and asked that Pacifica lose its license to broadcast. The FCC's investigation of the incident would last months. Finally, in 1975, Douglas's complaint was upheld, and Pacifica was issued a warning. Of particular concern to the commission was that the broadcast went out at 2 p.m., a time they believed many children would be listening. No sanctions or fines were imposed in the end, but the commission warned Pacifica that future complaints could potentially lead to the cancellation of their license. Pacifica, as you might imagine, wasn't happy having a threat like that hanging over their corporate head, so they sued the FCC in federal court. The case, known as Federal Communications Commission versus Pacifica Foundation, was initially decided by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit. In a 2-to-1 vote, the court ruled the FCC did not have the power to order Pacifica to stop broadcasting the 7 words routine. One of the judge's opinions stated that the time of the broadcast was irrelevant.
That's irrelevant.
Ultimately, the FCC's mandate was found to be unconstitutionally vague and overbroad. Despite the opinion of the court, the FCC maintained that it was their legal duty to stop inappropriate bits like Carlin's 7 words from going out over the airwaves. They appealed, and the case went before the Supreme Court of the United States. The issue before both the District and Supreme Court was about how to define the difference between indecency and obscenity, and whether the FCC had the power to censor either. Justice John Paul Stevens looked for guidance in a court decision from 1926, which discussed the idea that indecency may be a right thing in a wrong place, like a pig in the parlor instead of the barnyard. In the case of the 7 words, he believed that being accessible to children through broadcast media made it a public nuisance and therefore within the FCC's power to censor. In their own defense, Pacifica argued that the definitions proposed by the FCC were wildly overbroad and would prevent uncensored broadcast of great works of classical and contemporary literature, including even passages from the Bible. Surely the justices wouldn't allow such an absurdity, would they? In 1978, by a vote of 5-4, the Supreme Court held that the FCC did have a limited power to regulate the content of broadcast media. It further held that the 7 words routine was well within those limits and the FCC was entitled to act. The majority opinion discussed how children listening would have no warning about the content of the broadcast, and the easy access to that broadcast meant that the First Amendment protection would be limited. The dissent called the majority misguided and pointed out that the decision could prevent revered works of art and literature from being broadcast merely because they contained a few 4-letter words. Nonetheless, the ruling remains law today. The Supreme Court's decision in FCC v. Pacifica was controversial when it was made and remains so today. Prominent First Amendment attorney Floyd Abrams called the decision wrong-headed, and during a similar case in 2012, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg argued that the opinion was wrong when it was issued. She asked the rest of the court to reconsider the Pacifica case, pointing out that time and technology had altered the media landscape so much that the original ruling was untenable anyway. Despite the fact that Carlin's 7 words routine was the spark that ignited the case of FCC versus Pacifica, George himself wasn't a party to the litigation and had no stake in the case. In fact, he had no participation at all. He wasn't even called to testify on behalf of Pacifica. Legally speaking, the FCC wasn't after Carlin and generally had no objections to his material. Their wrath was aimed solely at Pacifica for playing the 7 words routine during daytime hours. Same for the original plaintiff, John Douglas, who went on record saying he had no objections to the 7 words routine for private use. While Carlin disagreed with the Supreme Court's decision, he didn't take it too hard. In fact, he actually found the whole thing pretty amusing. Decades later, he would reflect on the fact that the case was still being taught in law schools and say that he took a perverse pride in being a footnote to the judicial history of the United States.
So that's what I love, is that gotcha moment when you catch the culture with its pants down.
Media watchdog John H. Douglas, for his part, would insist that he was after Pacifica, not Carlin. He even admitted that he laughed out loud at the 7 words bit when he heard it. Pacifica and the 7 words may have lost the legal battle, but they won the cultural war. The legal fallout from the bit made the routine a high-profile symbol in the struggle to loosen taboos about so-called naughty words and bring an end to the kind of legal persecution that destroyed Carlin's idol, Lenny Bruce. In 2011, a study found that 47% of Facebook profiles contained profanity, and between 2005 and 2010, the use of such language on television increased a whopping 69%. Today, television offers incredibly explicit forms of entertainment.
Should I tell you when I plan to take a tomorrow? Would that be none of your business?
Streaming internet services like Netflix are even less regulated. These realities mean that while broadcast TV and radio still face strict FCC oversight, such regulatory schemes are rapidly becoming pointless. On June 22, 2008, George Carlin died of heart failure at St. John's Hospital Center in Santa Monica, California. His obituary in the New York Times called him an heir of Lenny Bruce, who gave voice to an indignant counterculture and assaulted the barricades of censorship on behalf of a generation of comics that followed him. It also specifically cited the 7 words you can never say on television routine, and called it one of the many ways he took aim at what he thought of as the palliating and obfuscating agents of American life: politicians, advertisements, religion, the media, and conventional thinking of all stripes.
Cursing, cussing, swearing. All I could think of was shit, motherfucking tits, man.
Carlin was so ahead of his time that even a decade after his death, his comedy still held up. In 2017, Rolling Stone magazine called him an MIT-level linguist, a First Amendment activist, and the undisputed champion gadfly of stand-up. They named him the second-best stand-up comic of all time, behind only Richard Pryor, a man who considered Carlin one of his biggest influences. And he wasn't the only one. Some of the comics that claim Carlin as an influence include Chris Rock, Jon Stewart, Bill Burr, and Bill Hicks. Nobody saw Sam Kinison's death coming, at least not the way it happened. Most people assumed he'd succumb to substance abuse, but Kinison said that was under control. Things actually looked good for Kinison leading up to his death. He just got married days earlier, and he was experiencing a career resurgence. Then, an intoxicated teenage driver in a pickup truck came along. Today, we're going to recount the final hours of Sam Kinison's life. Sam Kinison must have felt like a new man as he opened up his white 1989 Pontiac Trans Am northbound on Interstate 15, speeding through Barstow, California. He had just returned from a 5-day Hawaiian honeymoon with his new wife, Malika Suwiri. He proudly bragged to his friends in the press that he was clean and sober for the last year or so, and Hollywood film studios were returning his calls again after critics praised Kinison's recent television appearances, including his co-hosting gig on Fox's New Year's Eve Live. And if his film career was improving, his stand-up career was almost back to its late 80s glory. As a matter of fact, the reason why Kinison was on this road trip was because he was on his way to headline a stand-up gig. But you have to remember, while time favors Kinison's legacy, the reality is that not too long before his death, his career as an A-list comedian was over. Kinison's career catapulted in the span of 5 years. From his national television debut on HBO's career-making Young Comedians special in 1985, to legendary guest spots for Late Night and The Tonight Show, 3 LPs, 2 were certified gold, recurring appearances on Saturday Night Live, and theater-sized concerts that paid him up to $50,000 per set. Yet with all that success, he crashed and burned hard thanks to marathon drug-fueled binges which turned Kinison into kind of a jerk. As much as they loved him, fellow comedians like Marc Maron and Joe Rogan have mentioned how miserable it was to be around Kinison during those peak powder years. Ultimately, it was Kinison's substance abuse that pushed Hollywood away. Eventually, United Artists withdrew their offer for Kinison to star in what would be his first leading role. Fans walked out on his barely intelligible stand-up sets, where at times he had to run backstage to revive himself by sucking on oxygen tanks. And in 1990, his third album tanked. HBO and MTV cut ties. Spurned by desperation, Kinison clawed his way back. By early 1992, he said he was clean. Kinison was in negotiations for a 2-picture deal with New Line Cinema, and the paychecks for his stand-up shows were back in the 5-figure range. This headlining weekend at the Riverside Resort and Casino in Laughlin he was driving towards was a sign of big things on the horizon. It felt like Sam Kinison was on a comeback. At approximately 7:30 p.m., Kinison was zipping eastbound on Interstate 40 along the Mojave Desert National Preserve, about 50 or 60 miles away from Laughlin, and he was making great time. At this pace, Kinison, along with his new wife, who was riding shotgun in his Trans Am, and his brother Bill, along with fellow comedian Carl LeBove, who were trailing behind the newlyweds in a van, were expected to make Laughlin by 8:30. Troy Pearson was about an hour into a road trip of his own. While Kinison was zipping eastbound on Interstate 40, Pearson, the 17-year-old Bonanza High School senior, was about 40 miles into his 230-plus drive to Palm Springs. Pearson was headed to his senior spring break vacation. Behind the wheel of his old Chevrolet truck, packed with a bag of clothes and toiletries to last a week, along with a bunch of beer for the road, Pearson and a classmate were speeding towards Sam and Malika. Within 30 minutes, the comedy world would never be the same again. As Kinison exited Highway 40 and merged north onto the small 2-lane Interstate 95, he must have known he was about 30 minutes from the casino. After all, he made this trip to Laughlin before for previous stand-up gigs. While Kinison was navigating the 40 to 95 off-ramp, Pearson and his buddy had just sped past the Nevada-California border. According to witnesses, Pearson was driving well over the speed limit and merging into the oncoming traffic lane to pass slower vehicles. And that's when Kinison and Pearson came face to face near Needles, California, about 3.5 miles north of the 40 to 95 interchange. The sun had just set and visibility was limited. As Pearson barreled southbound on the narrow 2-lane desert road, he swerved one last time into Kinison's northbound lane in an attempt to bypass the car in front of him and dart back into his own lane. Kinison saw the pickup headlights rushing towards him. He slowed down the Trans Am between 15 and 25 miles per hour to give Pearson more runway to complete his maneuver, but it wasn't enough. The full-sized Chevy truck slammed directly into Kinison's car at 70 miles per hour, creating a crash impact of 95 miles per hour. Not wearing his seatbelt, Kinison was thrown headfirst into his car's windshield. Immediately after impact, Kinison's body broke off his steering wheel, ricocheted off the windshield, and landed in between his car's 2 front seats. Malika, who also wasn't wearing a seatbelt, was laid up next to him. She was knocked unconscious, but breathing. Sam's brother and manager Bill, along with his longtime friend Carl Lebov, who were in the van behind Kinison and witnessed the collision, pulled over immediately and rushed towards the mangled vehicles. As Lebov ran towards the Trans Am to tend to the Kinisons, Bill looked around and surveyed the scene. Steam emitted from the vehicle's engines, and fluids pooled up along the highway asphalt. Witnesses say Pearson exited the cab of his truck, and the first thing he said was, "God, look at my truck." Lebov, who had been Kinison's opening act for years, found Kinison responsive, but groggy. Lebov was stunned when it seemed his friend was going to pull through. With only a small 2-inch cut visible over his left eyebrow and a bloody lip, Kinison lifted himself out of his car's wreckage. Lebov, who thought that Kinison's injuries were more serious, begged him to lay down on the side of the road and wait for an ambulance, which was already on its way. As his wife remained unconscious in the Trans Am's passenger seat, Kinison finally followed Lebov's advice and laid down on the gravelly shoulder of the road, propped up in his friend's arms. Meanwhile, a small crowd of drivers who pulled over to help noticed beer cans all over the crash site. Bill also discovered beer cans in the cab of Pearson's truck. It was about this time that Lebov said Kinison started talking towards the sky. He said that Kinison was clear, coherent, and softly said, "I don't want to die. I don't want to die." Then Kinison paused, as if he was listening to the person he was talking to. "But why?" Kinison asked, followed by another pause. Then he said, "Okay, okay, okay." As Lebov held Kinison's head in his hands, he recalls that his last okay was soft, almost like a whisper. Then, at 8:31 p.m., as paramedics were rushing to the scene, Kinison's body relaxed, and he took his last breath. At 38 years old, the former Pentecostal tent preacher's final conversation was with God. Ironic, considering how the comedian railed against religion for the entirety of his career. Although he had already passed, the first ambulance on the scene rushed Kinison to the Colorado River Medical Center in Needles, about 6 miles from the crash site. While mouth-to-mouth resuscitation was performed on Kinison at the crash site and on the way to the hospital, the comedian's passing was pronounced at 8:31 p.m. Malika, who was taken to the same hospital in a separate ambulance, was able to leave 2 days later, but Kinison's body stayed behind for an autopsy, and Lebov was correct. Although Kinison looked okay immediately after the crash, his body had sustained incredible internal trauma. Deputy Coroner Gabriel Morales said that the comedian suffered multiple traumatic injuries to the chest cavity. Troy Pearson, who sustained moderate injuries in the crash, didn't have much of a trial, but that's only because he was a minor. In a brief court appearance, a judge sentenced the teen with felony vehicular manslaughter with gross negligence. The charge came with a year of probation, a 2-year suspended driver's license, and 300 hours of community service. Pearson was released to the custody of his parents, and that was it. In addition to his outrage over the slap on Pearson's wrist for killing his brother, Bill Kinison was livid over Pearson's brief court appearance. At no time did I see any remorse, but there's nothing we can do about it now. A year after his death in 1993, Kinison was as popular as he was at his late 80s peak. His fourth and final comedy album, Live from Hell, was released to great critical acclaim. It even won that year's Grammy Award for Best Spoken Comedy Album against The Jerky Boys, The Jerky Boys 2, and Adam Sandler's They're All Gonna Laugh at You. Bill also kept his brother's memory alive with Brother Sam, The Short, Spectacular Life of Sam Kinison, the 1994 biography about the comedian. The movie rights to the book were purchased by fan and friend Howard Stern, and at one point, HBO was talking about producing it with Kinison being played by Dan Fogler. Kinison's memory seems to be stuck in a holding pattern now. The Brother Sam movie never got past the script stage, and the 2017 biopic I Am Sam Kinison, while sourcing much of Bill's book, didn't feel like a proper send-off. In a recent interview, Bill mentioned movie deals that were in development at the time of his death. One such deal was a movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger, and another with Rick Moranis. It's easy to imagine what direction Kinison would have taken had he avoided his fatal accident in the desert and continued his newfound upward trajectory. Leading roles in motion pictures, arena tours, a family, and imagine how Kinison would have approached today's fevered political climate. Everyone who's ever watched a reality TV show probably knows that much of the so-called reality is a total lie. But the popular prank show Punk'd took stretching the truth to a whole new level. So, today we're going to take a look at how the producers of MTV's Punk'd manipulated viewers even more than any of the show's celebrity targets. Okay, time to look at how we all got punked by Punk'd. For those who don't remember, Punk'd, which aired on MTV from 2003 through 2007, was a reality TV series hosted by Ashton Kutcher, famous for both his starring role as Michael Kelso in Fox's sitcom That 70s Show and for general handsomeness. Punk'd was a hidden camera prank reality series in the tradition of shows like Candid Camera and TV's Bloopers and Practical Jokes, in which Kutcher and his crew would trap unwitting celebrity guests in ridiculous scenarios and film their reactions. Kutcher had originally started work on a series called Harassment, in which he would play practical jokes on ordinary, non-famous people. Despite coming up with a title that perfectly encapsulates the entire prank show genre, Kutcher ultimately abandoned the premise after he got sued for placing a fake dead body in the pool of the Hard Rock Hotel in Las Vegas. Oh boy, Ashton, that is comedy. Thwarted by the laws of both man and common decency, he came up with a new idea. That idea was Punk'd, and the new spin was that the practical jokes would be played on celebrities rather than regular Joes, presumably because image-conscious famous people would be better sports about the whole thing and therefore less likely to sue. The show managed to pull the wool over some pretty famous eyes, including Justin Timberlake, Jessica Biel, Tracy Morgan, Lindsay Lohan, Kirsten Dunst, Hugh Jackman, Zoe Saldana, Kanye West, The Rock, Beyonce, and many, many more. Along the way, Kutcher and his co-producers discovered that pulling off a prank show on targets who are already conditioned to look for cameras everywhere is a lot harder than it seems. They would quickly turn to editing tricks and outright fabrication to get the content they needed. Part of what made Punk'd so memorable was getting to watch celebrities gradually melt down in the middle of an absurd situation. After all, the entire point of a prank show is to capture a person's unaltered reaction to a practical joke, right? Well, not so much. Often, the celebrity target wasn't happy with whatever their natural reaction turned out to be, and did not want the public to see it. And we get it. You aren't going to make the most flattering expression when you're blowing up a wedding or watching the government repossess your dog. In such cases, the raw footage was left on the cutting room floor and replaced with alternate, less embarrassing takes. One famous example is the episode featuring the rapper Drake. Drake thought he was going to meet then Vice President Joe Biden when the Punk'd crew faked an earthquake. In the episode that aired, Drake is appropriately alarmed, but his initial unedited reaction was apparently much more dramatic. According to Ashton Kutcher's recollection of events, Drake jumped and curled up into the fetal position on his friend's lap. Guess we know why that hotline stopped blinging. Fans of the show may have thought Ashton Kutcher personally orchestrated every prank on Punk'd, since he's almost always shown issuing commands via earpiece to the actors carrying out the pranks. But of course, Kutcher wasn't in charge of whether or not a prank went too far. Instead, MTV had a whole team of lawyers providing on-site legal advice as to whether or not a prank should be stopped. As Kutcher put it, the primary responsibility of these lawyers was to ensure that at no point in time were we breaking any laws or endangering anyone in any way. It's a long way to say covering our ass. But even with teams of lawyers trying to keep things within the bounds of legal propriety, Fak'd sometimes got dangerous. For example, in Serena Williams' episode, the tennis star bravely drives a car at nearly 100 miles per hour in pursuit of 2 children. Again, super funny, Ashton. Rob Pinkston, who played a teenager in the episode, admitted that they pushed the boundaries of personal safety because he felt like his job was on the line. According to Pinkston, I had Punk'd co-creators Jason Goldberg and Ashton Kutcher in my ear during the bit, and they told us to keep going as long as it was safe. But I think we stretched the safe part a bit. Fooling one of the world's greatest athletes into driving like she's in last place in Mario Kart is definitely considered unsafe by most traffic courts. Furthermore, Pinkston claims that the producers were only concerned that he saved the sketch by shaking Serena off his tail during the chase. When the episode aired, the editing made it appear like Williams was told to drive to where the kids were taken. The entire prank was essentially rewritten after the fact to make it less upsetting and less potentially illegal. The performers on Fak'd claimed they were frequently encouraged to take things too far. For example, Julia Wolof, who acted in an episode of Fak'd featuring rapper Jadakiss, said that producers tried to get her to push Jadakiss to his boiling point, even though they knew he might be armed. Oh, that is genius, Ashton. When she voiced her discomfort to the producers, she claims they told her not to worry about it and just to keep going, which lines up with Pinkston's recollection of the Serena Williams episode. Playing a practical joke means dropping an unsuspecting person into a situation that is jarring and stressful, and it's difficult to predict how they will respond. Some people just roll with the unusual circumstances. Some get flustered or become emotional, and some will become outright violent. The last one is a lot more common than you may suspect. There's an entire subgenre of YouTube devoted to pranks that end in fistfights. In fact, Fak'd dealt with so many near misses that the show had a standing policy. If you see a weapon, shut the prank down and reveal yourself immediately. Why so specific? Someone actually pulled a gun in an unaired episode featuring the Black Eyed Peas. A physical altercation broke out when someone in that group's entourage pulled out the weapon. But that was far from the only time things got nasty. Fak'd often manipulated celebrity reactions in post, especially when the star was painted in a negative light. Nobody wants to watch Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson pummel improv theater graduates for pretending to steal his Escalade, especially not Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. For example, in the episode featuring Zach Braff, the actor actually threw punches when he thought someone had painted graffiti on his brand new Porsche. Rob Pinkston, who played the delinquent teenager, admitted that the star tried to beat him up as he ran towards fellow actor Chris Elwood, who was playing a security guard. As he ran, a terrified Pinkston could feel Braff's swings hitting his jacket. Elwood vouched for Pinkston's story, verifying that Braff did indeed try to attack Rob Pinkston, but struck Elwood's arm instead. To quote Elwood directly, Braff definitely wanted to stomp the ever-living crap out of this kid. To spare Braff the indignity of looking like a violent maniac, MTV cut the punches out of the broadcast, making it appear as though Braff had merely shouted expletive-laden threats at Pinkston. In fairness, "He might beat the shit out of us" is a reaction you should anticipate if you pretend to ruin a guy's $100,000 sports car. Arguably, the most viral episode of Fak'd featured megastar Justin Timberlake, although in reality, he was not the sweet, helpless dude he appeared to be on the show. Timberlake described his side of the story in a 2011 interview with Playboy, during which he revealed that the prank itself, in which the pop star's possessions were supposedly being seized by the IRS, lasted much longer than what was shown on TV. According to him, the 10-minute segment shown on the episode was actually cut down from a 45-minute ordeal and featured a much more aggressive reaction. Timberlake recalled showing up at his house, demanding to know what all these people were doing on his property, and repeatedly ordering them to leave, only with a Tarantino amount of F-bombs. But that behavior, while an honest reaction, was inconsistent with Timberlake's generally clean-cut image, and so it was deleted from the episode. Apparently, JT is only comfortable looking like a jerk in a David Fincher movie. Fak'd depicts Ashton Kutcher and the gang as brilliant pranksters who could outsmart virtually anyone, wreaking havoc on totally clueless celebrities. But in reality, Kutcher really didn't have a great track record at all when it came to fooling his famous acquaintances. For instance, Kutcher tried to punk Neve Campbell multiple times, but only succeeded in fooling her on the third attempt. Meanwhile, the band Simple Plan proved to be nigh unpunkable after they spotted the show's hidden cameras. Ironically, pranking them required a more complicated strategy than their name suggests. But Nick Cannon was by far the hardest celebrity to punk. The crew reportedly tried to prank him no less than 4 times with no success. Ultimately, none of the episodes featuring Cannon ever aired, but Kuchar decided to hire him instead, and Cannon began assisting with pranks in the show's 9th season. Another problem was that as Punk'd grew in popularity, their cast became too recognizable to fly under the radar. As a result, the celebrity targets began to recognize the Punk'd crew, even if the show liked to pretend otherwise. In an episode featuring Lil Jon, Ashton Kutcher used some repeat actors to play customs agents who tried to convince the rapper his plane was heading for Ecuador rather than Las Vegas. Lil Jon recognized the actors and demanded Kutcher reveal himself, reportedly yelling, "You can't punk the king of crunk." And before you ever try that on your own, remember, that particular phrase only works when Lil Jon says it. Baywatch star Pamela Anderson, for example, reportedly knew the prank was happening the entire time. In her unaired Punk'd episode, she was led to believe that an adult movie was being filmed in her garden. However, Anderson claims she knew it was a prank the entire time, and some stars were so unpunkable that Kutcher wouldn't even attempt fooling them. For example, Kutcher took a pass on punking notorious master prankster George Clooney after Brad Pitt warned him against it. Well, we can't argue with the logic of doing whatever Brad Pitt tells you. It's a shame we were robbed of the chance to see George Clooney turn the tables on the early aughts' most famous goofball. Though it finished its original run in 2007, the producers of Punk'd knew there would always be a market for celebrity prank shows. In March 2012, Punk'd returned to MTV. Only this time, original host Ashton Kutcher was replaced by a series of guest hosts, including Justin Bieber, Bam Margera, Tyler the Creator, and Miley Cyrus, among several others. Following that revival, a 10th season with new hosts King Bach and D-Storm Power was produced for BET in 2015, featuring celebrity targets like Michael B. Jordan, Rosario Dawson, and Zendaya. And in 2020, an 11th season aired on the short-lived Quibi streaming service, hosted by Chance the Rapper and featuring pranks on Meg Thee Stallion, Addison Rae, and Lil Nas X. It's hard to say if we've really seen the last of Punk'd, but we can hope. But if you happen to be a celebrity, it might be a good idea to keep an eye out for hidden cameras. You know, more than usual. The first U.S. federal judge assassinated in the 20th century was the Honorable John H. Wood, Jr. of Texas. His killer, Charles Boyd Harrelson, would eventually receive 2 life sentences for the crime. Charles is also the father of actor Woody Harrelson. Today we're going to take a look at Charles Harrelson, encyclopedia salesman, hitman, and father of Woody Harrelson. Charles Harrelson was born in the town of Lovelady, Texas, on July 23, 1938. When he was old enough, he enlisted in the United States Navy and continued to serve until 1959. After being discharged, he moved to Los Angeles, where he worked multiple jobs, including encyclopedia salesman and professional gambler. He also met Diane Lou Oswald, the woman who would become his wife. During this time, Charles began a steady descent into what would become a life of crime. He would be arrested for the first time at the age of 21, and by the age of 35, he would be serving his first stretch in prison. Charles and Diane eventually moved to Houston, Texas, where they had 3 boys, Woody, Brett, and Jordan. The family, however, wouldn't last. Charles divorced Diane in 1965 and married his next wife, Betty. Things got worse from there. Charles kept gambling and wound up in debt to several organized crime outfits. Then, in 1968, he was arrested for armed robbery. The charges wouldn't stick, and Charles wouldn't stick around. He abandoned his family and disappeared into the criminal underworld. Woody was in elementary school at the time. Despite being so young, he knew his father had serious problems. Years later, the actor would recall in interviews that even prior to his parents' separation, his father was constantly in and out of jail and was rarely around. In order to pay off the considerable gambling debts he had accumulated, Charles Harrelson became a hired hitman. His first alleged hit came in 1958, and the target was Alan Berg, a carpet salesman from the Houston area. This killing, which would later be the subject of the book Run, Brother, Run, a memoir of a murder in my family by Berg's brother David, was allegedly contracted by a business rival for the price of $1,500. In his book, David Berg alleges that Charles used his then-girlfriend, Sandra Sue Attaway, to lure Alan into a car where Harrelson then ambushed him. Alan was forced at gunpoint to drive to a remote location where Harrelson shot him in the head. Then, just to be sure the job was done, Harrelson strangled the wounded man. In 1970, Charles was put on trial for the murder of Alan Berg. During the trial, his lawyer called several alibi witnesses who must have convinced the jury because Harrelson was acquitted. David Berg, in the years since, has disputed this testimony and steadfastly maintained that Charles Harrelson was his brother's killer. Pete Thomas Scamardo was a grain broker who also happened to run a drug smuggling business. His partner in that heroin business was one Sam DeGelia Jr. But when Sam lost a large shipment during a traffic stop in Kansas City, Pete decided to end the partnership. To this end, Scamardo paid Charles Harrelson $2,000 to bump off DeGelia. Charles was arrested for the crime, and at the trial, he was represented by famed defense attorney Percy Foreman. The lawyer found a nightclub singer who was willing to testify that Charles was with her at the time of the murders. The jury hung, and Charles was granted a retrial. The retrial would go differently. Seeking to avoid a charge of perjury, the nightclub singer fled the country and wasn't available to testify a second time. Without her, Charles's defense fell apart, and he was convicted. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison, but only wound up serving 5 thanks to earning time off for good behavior. After Charles Harrelson had abandoned his family, Woody, his mother, and siblings moved to Lebanon, Ohio. Along with his brothers, young Woody had absolutely no contact with his father after 1968. In fact, it wouldn't be until 1973 that the future natural-born killer star would learn about his father's trial for the DeGelia murder. According to Woody, he found out from the radio. He was in a car waiting for a friend of his mother who was picking him up from school when he overheard a news report about Charles V. Harrelson and his trial for murder. The 12-year-old boy figured there probably weren't 2 men with that name, so it must be his father. He would later describe it as a wild realization. Charles Harrelson spent the years 1973 through 1978 serving time in prison for the DeGelia homicide. After being released, it didn't take long for him to get back to his old tricks. In 1979, Jimmy Chagra was a drug lord and a member of the Dixie Mafia. He was also on trial for trafficking and facing a potentially long sentence. As if that wasn't bad enough, the federal judge presiding over his trial was John H. Wood Jr., who was known by the nickname Maximum John. If you guessed he got that nickname from always handing out maximum sentences, you're one clever cookie, and you understand why Jimmy decided the judge had to be whacked before the trial ended. For the price of $250,000, Chagra hired Charles Harrelson to eliminate Judge Wood. On Tuesday, May 29, 1970, in San Antonio, Texas, Judge Wood was walking out of his house to head for work when he noticed his car had a flat tire. As he bent down to examine the flat, Charles Harrelson approached and shot him in the back of the skull with a high-powered rifle. Wood perished instantly, making him the first federal judge to be assassinated in the 20th century. Costing over $11 million, the investigation into the murder of Judge Wood was the most expensive of its kind in FBI history. There was no physical evidence that pointed to who the shooter might be, but investigators had their eye on Jimmy Chagra. Even with Judge Wood dead, Chagra was facing 30 years in prison for drug trafficking. After recording over 1,000 separate conversations Chagra had in his jail cell, the FBI pieced together what happened. Charles Harrelson's trial lasted 40 days and included the presentation of 130 witnesses and over 300 exhibits. When all was said and done, he was convicted and sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences for the murder, plus an additional 5 years. At the same time, his then-wife, Joanne Harrelson, was sentenced to 25 years for conspiracy. Turns out she had purchased the murder weapon for Charles under an assumed name. By the way, Jimmy Chagra, the man who started it all, he was acquitted. And justice for all. In his life, Charles Harrelson was tried for 3 contract killings and convicted of 2. However, if you believe the man himself, that's just the tip of a very scary iceberg. Harrelson claims to have killed somewhere in the neighborhood of 50, yes, 50 people on behalf of various organized crime figures. That's a lot of people. Despite the confession, not everyone believes him. While serving time for the killing of Judge Wood, Charles sent a letter to a man named Kenny Gallo, a former mob associate who, at the time, was hiding via the FBI Witness Relocation Program. Harrelson told Gallo that he was planning to write a book that would reveal the truth behind all of his crimes. However, the ex-mobster wasn't convinced. According to Gallo, Harrelson likely killed more than 2 people, but nowhere near 50. He said Charles may have been involved in that many killings, maybe driving the car or something, but he only carried out maybe 6 killings himself. If Gallo was skeptical, it might be because Harrelson had a habit of confessing to things he didn't do. For example, in 1980, after a standoff with the police, Charles Harrelson was arrested for the murder of Judge Wood. During that standoff, Charles amazingly confessed to the police that he was, in fact, the true assassin of President John F. Kennedy. Of course, he was high out of his mind on cocaine at the time, so take it for what it's worth. We've all been there, right? Law enforcement, for their part, didn't buy it, and Charles himself later admitted it was just a lie he hoped would incentivize the police not to shoot him on the spot. A 1988 documentary about the Kennedy assassination features an interview with Harrelson, in which he explains he wasn't even in Dallas on the day Kennedy died. He was in Houston. Despite these retractions, there are those who still believe his initial confession. The character Woody Boyd from Cheers came from the town of Hanover, Indiana. The actor Woody Harrelson went to school at Indiana's Hanover College, and that's where he was when he learned about his father's trial for the murder of Judge Wood. Woody was 20 years old at that point, and his father had played no role in his upbringing. Nonetheless, Woody decided to reach out to Charles. It wasn't easy, but the two men slowly began to build a relationship, and in 1987, Woody served as a proxy for Charles in his 4th marriage. In an interview with People magazine a year later, Woody said that he looked at Charles as more of a potential friend than a father, and he was still gauging whether the man merited his loyalty. In 1995, with the help from 2 convicted bank robbers, Charles Harrelson used makeshift ropes to scale the wall of Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. Unfortunately for Charles and his cohorts, the guards in the prison tower immediately figured out what was going on and fired a warning shot. All 3 convicts were quickly recaptured. As punishment, Charles was transferred to ADX Florence, a supermax prison in Florence, Colorado, known as one of the nation's most secure facilities. Strangely, Harrelson didn't mind. He may have even liked it there. In a letter to a friend, he said, "The silence is wonderful, and feeling left alone is great. Nobody bothers me." Charles Harrelson would spend the rest of his life denying the slaying of Judge Wood. He insisted that on the day of the shooting, he was miles away, in Dallas. Still later, he would claim that he had been working with a professional gambler named George Kay to con Jimmy Chagra out of the $250,000 bounty by merely taking credit for the killing. Woody Harrelson would help Charles try to get a new trial. Their plea was based on the fact that Charles's conviction rested on the testimony of prisoners who were all offered reduced sentences in exchange for their cooperation. Woody described this effort as just being a son trying to help his dad. The appeal stalled, and Charles Harrelson died of a heart attack in 2007. He was 69. For years, The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson was the ultimate late-night tastemaker, and pretty much the only real game in town. But then, the 1990s ushered a golden age of late-night comedy that shaped the television landscape for generations to come. So, today, we're channel flipping through the late-night talk show wars of the 90s. Okay, here's Weird History. Johnny Carson took over as the host of The Tonight Show from Jack Paar in 1962, so he wasn't the show's first host, but for a generation of comedians, he was the show's ultimate host. He retired in 1992, handing his chair over to comedian Jay Leno. That decision famously sent Carson's spurned friend, David Letterman, to rival network CBS to create his own show, The Late Show with David Letterman. Spoiler alert, he did just fine. In 2005, Carson passed away. Soon after, on an episode of The Late Show, Letterman delivered his usual laugh-filled opening monologue, and then revealed it had been written by Carson. Since he had retired, Carson had been sending Letterman jokes to use in any monologues. A world-class comedian to the end. But Leno hadn't been handed the gig out of the blue. He was a veteran comedian who had previously served as a guest host on The Tonight Show, and he would soon have a chance to prove himself in a crisis. During an appearance on The Tonight Show, legendary comedian Rodney Dangerfield seemed ever so slightly off his game, but it would take someone who knew his act intimately to notice. That someone was Tonight Show host Jay Leno, who had known Dangerfield for years. As it turns out, Dangerfield actually was suffering a mini-stroke. As Leno later recalled, "I know Rodney and I know his act, and his movements were off. As he was doing his stand-up, I told our producer, 'I think Rodney's having a stroke or heart attack. Call the paramedics.'" Leno's decision to have the producers get help saved the comedian, and while Rodney would recover, he still got no respect. When Jay Leno took over from Johnny Carson as host of The Tonight Show, he had some awfully big shoes to fill. And leaving along with Carson was his longtime sidekick, Ed McMahon, also a legend. So as Leno went about making the show his own, he reached out to Phil Hartman about possibly filling the sidekick role. Hartman was already considering leaving Saturday Night Live in 1991, since his friend and collaborator Jan Hooks had just left the show. But ultimately, Hartman decided to stay at SNL, where he was the sketch show's go-to Bill Clinton impersonator. As for Leno, he would ultimately get actor, voiceover man, and former Letterman production assistant Ed Hall to replace Ed McMahon. Well, as if anyone could ever replace Ed McMahon. Letterman has said and done a lot of wacky things on his show, but nothing quite as wacky as that time when the host took a moment to spill the beans on a real-life extortion plot, of which he was the target. The comedian and talk show host has long been known for his bizarre sense of humor, so you could be forgiven for thinking it was just a strange joke. Even the audience wasn't completely sure whether he was telling the truth or setting up a big punchline. But it was very real. Letterman had found a box in the back seat of his car containing evidence of him engaging in sexual relationships with members of his staff, along with a note threatening to expose him. The blackmailer demanded $2 million, threatening to write both a screenplay and a book exposing Letterman's secrets if they didn't receive the money. If that particular threat makes you instantly suspect the blackmailer was a writer, then congratulations, detective. The blackmailer, Joe Halderman, was a writer and producer of the true crime journalism series 48 Hours. Maybe he wanted to star in his own episode. Letterman worked with police to deliver the blackmailer a fake check, which led to Halderman's arrest. Letterman then confessed on air that the information the blackmailer had was accurate. He had been involved in inappropriate relationships with members of his staff. His reputation took a hit, but audiences quickly forgave him. In 1993, comedian Bill Hicks was famous for his biting social commentary and his take-no-prisoners approach. Still, it was no less shocking when he was censored by CBS and had his routine cut from a broadcast of The Late Show with David Letterman, the first time a comedy act had ever been censored at CBS's Ed Sullivan Theater. So, what did Hicks say that was so bad it had to be cut from the show? Well, the comedian riffed on a number of sensitive issues, including abortion and the Bible. And while his comments probably wouldn't be considered that incendiary today, network television in 1993 was a different story. By now, you're probably asking which foolish network executive made the decision to pull the now legendary Hicks set from broadcast. Well, get ready to welcome our next guest, surprising revelation, because it was actually Letterman himself who made the decision not to air the set. On the top 10 list of things we didn't expect, that was number 1, Dave. Letterman was unaware Hicks had recently been diagnosed with cancer, and the comedian tragically passed away only 4 months later. In 2009, Letterman invited Hicks's mother onto the show to apologize for his decision and finally air the routine in its entirety. When Conan O'Brien was first announced as the heir apparent of late night after David Letterman departed for his own show on CBS, the whole world came together as one to say, "Who?" Though he's well known today, the lanky redhead had been mostly behind the scenes working as a writer on Saturday Night Live and The Simpsons. In fact, O'Brien was criticized mercilessly during his first few years on the job and was constantly the target of rumors that he'd be replaced. But one of those early negative reviews was actually written by O'Brien himself. After his first episode, O'Brien, a master of self-effacing humor, penned an op-ed piece making fun of himself and his show in the New York Times. His quick wit and genial charm eventually won people over, and he stuck around in the job for almost 28 years. For a period in the early 90s, the Arsenio Hall Show was the hottest thing in late night. It was the hip new show that had cool guests and appealed to younger viewers, even if it did have to deal with the occasional Steven Seagal. The Arsenio Hall Show was so popular, it may have helped swing an election. In 1992, when the show was hitting its pop culture stride, presidential hopeful Bill Clinton appeared as a guest. After his interview, Clinton threw on a pair of sunglasses and jammed with a house band, playing Heartbreak Hotel on a saxophone. Many Americans of both parties agreed it was the coolest thing a presidential candidate had ever done. And it, combined with an MTV appearance 2 weeks later, coincided with a sharp rise in Clinton's polling numbers against Ross Perot and the incumbent George H.W. Bush, both of whom he would eventually defeat. Bush should have thought about picking up a skateboard. Before he became one of the key faces of political comedy as the host of The Daily Show, Jon Stewart was a very different kind of television personality. In fact, when David Letterman left NBC for CBS in 1993, Stewart was on the short list of contenders to replace him. That job eventually went to Conan O'Brien, and Stewart instead went to host MTV's first foray into late-night talk show programming, The Jon Stewart Show. The show was a hit and eventually made its way from MTV to syndication as a replacement for The Arsenio Hall Show. However, the show's youthful vibe didn't carry over from the cable network, and it was soon canceled. Stewart bounced back, though, and secured himself a role in the hit Adam Sandler comedy Big Daddy. Oh, and a gig as the new host of The Daily Show, becoming one of the most influential political commentators of his era. Yes, NBA superstar Earvin Magic Johnson had a late-night talk show, and he did not have an easy time transitioning from the court to the stage. In fact, from the start, his 1998 show, The Magic Hour, was a complete fiasco, although that's admittedly a great title. Johnson didn't have any interview skills or even much chemistry with his sidekick, Craig Shoemaker, so he appeared understandably nervous, which is not the best vibe for a fun talk show. The Magic Hour was mocked mercilessly by shock jock Howard Stern on his radio show. So in response, Stern was booked as a guest. This turned out to be one of the biggest mistakes in the history of television. Johnson sat back timidly while Stern took control of the interview. He asked inappropriate questions about Johnson's HIV diagnosis and advised the basketball star to speak Ebonics, a controversial term negatively referring to African American vernacular English. Stern turned his attention to Johnson's co-hosts, asking where the recently fired Shoemaker was and harassing bandleader Sheila E., insisting she remove her shirt to improve ratings. In other words, Howard Stern behaved like Howard Stern. It was one of the most difficult to watch episodes in the history of late night, and The Magic Hour was canceled soon after. The moral of the story is, don't invite Howard Stern anywhere, unless you really want Howard Stern to show up. If you ask someone to name the most iconic host of The Daily Show, odds are they'll say Jon Stewart. And if you ask someone to name the host of The Late Late Show, it's probably going to be Craig Ferguson. But before either of those hosts took over their respective shows, Craig Kilborn was at the helm of them both. The man who was born to be replaced got his start in sports, serving as an anchor on ESPN SportsCenter. He then moved to Comedy Central in 1996 to launch The Daily Show, and moved to The Late Late Show on CBS in 1998. Kilborn departed that show in 2004, tossing the keys to Scottish comedian and actor Ferguson, who at the time was best known in the States for his role on The Drew Carey Show. The next future late-night star is probably watching to see what show Kilborn starts and leaves next. Both The Late Show with David Letterman and Late Night with Conan O'Brien debuted in 1993 and went on to be massive successes. But not everything that debuted that year did so well. If you don't believe us, just ask Chevy Chase. Yes, 1993 was also the year the Saturday Night Live legend stepped into the late-night host seat with his own talk show, which reviews called embarrassing and was canceled after just 6 weeks. Chase's decades-long reputation as being difficult to work with may explain why he struggled as a late-night host and was unable to connect with his guests and viewers. But the speed with which the show was pulled from the air, even after Fox racked up $3 million in ad buys for the first few episodes, was unexpected. Turns out, Chase wasn't Fox's first choice either. When the network initially went searching for a host for its foray into late night, it approached country music sensation Dolly Parton. She politely declined. and suggested Chase instead. Talk about going from 9 to 5. On October 1st, 1993, stand-up comedian Bill Hicks performed on David Letterman's new late-night talk show for the first time. It was a classic Hicks set that everyone had come to expect. In less than 7 minutes, Hicks delivered some of his most stinging commentary on America to date. Unfortunately, the only people who saw Hicks' set saw it live during the show's afternoon taping in the Ed Sullivan Theater. The comedian's performance never made it to air that evening. Letterman cut Hicks out of that night's episode. Today, we're going to find out why David Letterman banned Bill Hicks from The Late Show. Now, let's go back to October of '93, when Letterman was 1 month into his job at CBS. If you were a fan of comedian Bill Hicks in the mid-'80s and early '90s, watching him perform on Late Night with David Letterman was a regular treat. Hicks had performed on the show 11 times, and every set killed. Letterman, a former stand-up himself, was a fan of Hicks and never put any restrictions on the comedian. When Hicks made his first appearance on Letterman's new show, The Late Show with David Letterman, Letterman's feelings about Hicks's material changed. If you tuned into CBS at 11:30 on October 1st, 1993, expecting to see Hicks, you saw something completely different. But we'll get into that in a few minutes. To understand why Letterman censored Hicks, you have to know where the talk show host was in his career. After hosting Late Night on NBC in the 12:30 time slot for 11 years, Letterman left his show and NBC for what he thought would be greener pastures at CBS. We'll cover it soon enough in another episode of Weird History, but Letterman leaving NBC for CBS was a very big deal. In short, NBC jerked Letterman around. Letterman was fairly certain NBC would hand him the keys to The Tonight Show when Johnny Carson retired on May 21st, 1992. Instead, NBC went with Jay Leno, the safe choice for the prestigious 11:30 gig. Everyone, even Carson, thought Letterman should have gotten The Tonight Show. After Letterman was passed over, he told NBC to screw themselves, and he accepted CBS's offer to host another late-night talk show, which would eventually be called The Late Show. He would compete directly against The Tonight Show. It was a risky move for CBS. The network doubled Letterman's NBC salary and spent well over $150 million to bring him and his staff to their network and go against Leno. With all that money invested in their late-night lineup, the stakes were high for CBS. It's fair to say, Letterman felt some pressure too. Not only was he determined to beat Leno in ratings, he had to reinvent the show to make it more palatable for his new 11:30 audience. Now Letterman was up against Leno, NBC, CBS, national advertisers, and an older audience who might think wearing a suit of Rice Krispies or jumping on a felt wall in a Velcro suit were juvenile tricks unsuitable for an 11:30 crowd. It was fair to say Letterman was under pressure to deliver at CBS. This fact would be evident when he invited Hicks to do a set 1 month into his tenure at The Late Show. To understand why Letterman's decision to ban Hicks was so shocking, we also have to understand who Hicks was at the time. Hicks was no hack comedian with power management who got him on TV. Hicks had earned the spot. By October 1993, Hicks already had a couple of HBO specials. He was a frequent headliner at major comedy festivals. He had several live album releases, and he made his mark in Britain in 1991 at the Edinburgh Festival, where he won the Critics' Award and became an overnight folk hero in the UK. So not only was Hicks' Late Show appearance on October 1st routine, it was heavily anticipated by his fan base. We say this was Hicks' peak, but to be frank, Hicks never reached his full potential. When he performed for the Late Show audience, he was already being referred to as the next George Carlin. But what no one knew about Hicks was that he was dying. On June 16, 1993, about 3.5 months before his Late Show appearance, Hicks was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer that had spread to his liver. He had started receiving weekly chemotherapy, even during the days surrounding his Late Show set. If you paid attention to his routine, Hicks would drop hints in his set about a short time on Earth all the time after he was diagnosed. Hicks would often joke that any given performance could be his last. But it was no joke. Hicks was battling for his life, and he knew time was running out. His audience never had a clue. The Late Show had a pretty stacked schedule on October 1st, 1993. Letterman had actor Andy McDowell and Graham Parker as the night's musical guest. Hicks was booked as the evening's closer with a short stand-up set. That evening's show went smooth for the first 50 minutes. McDowell promoted Ruby Cairo, a movie so bad it was recut and retitled Deception. Parker sang "Passion is No Ordinary Word" off his new 2-disc anthology, which launched that week. By all accounts, a good show. Then, with maybe 10 or so minutes left in the show, Letterman returned from a commercial break and introduced Hicks as the show's final act. Describing him as a very entertaining comedian, Letterman plugged the stand-up's upcoming show at the Comedy Corner in West Palm Beach, Florida, and Hicks walked onto center stage of the Ed Sullivan Theater for the first time. It would also be the last time he and Letterman would speak to each other again. If you were in the Ed Sullivan Theater, you might have enjoyed Hicks' set. He went hard after pro-lifers and Christianity. Within the first 10 seconds of his set, he did a bit about his upcoming job as host of a new game show which was titled Let's Hunt and Kill Billy Ray Cyrus. Hicks explained the rules of the fictitious game show.
It's fairly self-explanatory. Each week we let the hounds of hell loose. We chase that jarhead, no-talent, cracker idiot all over the globe. Till I finally catch that fruity little ponytail of his, pull him to his knees, put a shotgun in his mouth. Then we'll be back in '94 with Let's Hunt and Kill Michael Bolton.
Now, if you were watching from home, you saw a very different show. After his opening monologue, Letterman announced the evening's guests: the lovely and talented Andie MacDowell, legendary rocker Graham Parker, and that was it. There was a clumsy edit to Paul Schaefer, and the broadcast continued. About 40 minutes later, with about 10 minutes left in the show, Letterman came back from a commercial break and announced, to an unknowing television audience, a funny and talented comedian. Then, with another choppy edit, he announced some guy no one had ever heard of at the time named Bill Sheft. Sheft was a late-night staff writer. But Hicks did perform that night, and as far as he was concerned, his set was a success. The Ed Sullivan Theater crowd roared with laughter. None of his jokes missed, and it was a solid set. Letterman even called Hicks over to his desk after the set and joked around with him before the end credits rolled. Hicks recalled Letterman jokingly said on camera, "Good set, Bill. Always nice to have you drop by with an uplifting message. Enjoy answering your mail for the next few weeks." Hicks said when he returned to the green room, staffers in the show were giving him nothing but positive feedback. And why wouldn't the feedback be positive? Like all comedians, Hicks had to submit his set to Letterman and his producers for final approval. The consensus Hicks got that night was, he killed. Letterman liked it, and the Late Show producers liked it. As far as Hicks was concerned, his 12th appearance for his old friend Dave was a success. Around 7 o'clock, about an hour after he left Letterman's theater, Hicks exited the shower in the Manhattan hotel room CBS put him up in for his appearance. The phone was ringing. It was Robert Morton, the executive producer of The Late Show. As the executive producer, one of Morton's jobs was to fall on his sword for Letterman. This evening, he had to tell Hicks that his segment would not be airing. When Hicks heard the news, he replied, "I don't understand, Robert. What's the problem? I thought the show went great." According to an interview he granted The New Yorker a couple weeks later, Hicks said that Morton praised his set. He even said he killed it out there. But the CBS Office of Standards and Practices felt that some of the material was unsuitable for broadcast. Hicks questioned which part of his set they found offensive. Before Hicks could finish asking his question, Morton said, "Almost all of it." After what Hicks called a very long conversation, Morton offered to book another late-night appearance and, according to the comedian, took the heat for not vetting the hot points out of his set. After the long phone call, Morton said, "Bill, it's not our decision," and apologized to Hicks, explaining that the show had to answer to the network. That would be the last time Hicks would hear from Letterman, Morton, or anyone from CBS. The promise to book him for another appearance seemed to be BS too. The truth was, the CBS Program Practices Department had nothing to do with the edit. The decision to ban Bill Hicks from the episode was solely that of Letterman and the late-night producers. On October 24, 1993, Hicks appeared on a small Texas cable access talk show called Cat's Eyes. In the 3 weeks since the Late Show censoring, it looked like Hicks had lost about 15 pounds. His hair was thinning, and he seemed a bit more frail and reserved than usual. His appearance on the show allowed him to exercise all of his spite and venom for Letterman, and everything that had to do with the Late Show incident by giving a blow-by-blow account of what happened. During the interview, Hicks made a point to say that his set was approved and reapproved by Letterman's producers. He also reiterated that his banned Letterman appearance was just another example of Americans losing their freedom of expression. While Hicks still seemed to show a bit of professional respect to Letterman during the interview, he did call him a sellout. But I come to find out that Dave, I guess $14 million was his price. You know what I mean? Everyone has a price, they say. Hicks was referring to Letterman's allegiance to CBS and his new $14 million a year salary they gave him. Letterman sided with money and career rather than his friend. 4 months later, Hicks would be dead. In 2009, Letterman aired an episode dedicated to the late comic, in which he invited Hicks's mother Mary on the show and apologized to her directly for not airing the set. He also finally aired the censored routine, which held up remarkably well in '09, but might not go over so well these days. The 2009 Late Show episode with Hicks's mother was interesting not just for what it revealed about Hicks at the time, but it revealed that Hicks's mother still seemed hurt by how Letterman's ban affected her critically ill son, that his work deserved better. She even made a couple of comments about how much the ban tore her son and her family apart at the time. Letterman sheepishly mumbled an apology every time she mentioned how hurt her son was. At the end of his interview with Hicks's mother, Letterman aired the set that he had banned 15 years earlier. When Hicks's taped set ended, Letterman told Mary, "I've not seen that videotape or any part of it since that night, and seeing it now raises the question, what's the matter with me? What was I thinking?" Hicks performed the final show of his career at Caroline's in New York on January 6, 1994. He moved back to his parents' house in Little Rock, Arkansas soon after. In his last weeks, he reread Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings and made telephone calls to friends to say goodbye before he stopped speaking on February 14th. For all of his shocking, groundbreaking work, Hicks would die quietly of pancreatic cancer on February 26, 1994, at the age of 32. Saturday Night Live's 20th season featured some of the show's funniest and most celebrated cast members, including Adam Sandler, Chris Farley, David Spade, and Tim Meadows. But the tumultuous events of that season nearly broke the show entirely, leading to a drastic cast shakeup by season 21. So, today we're going to take a look at how the now classic 1994-95 season of Saturday Night Live almost sabotaged the show. Okay? Live from the internet, it's Weird History. Well, not really live. That would be horrible. I'd actually have to get dressed. If anyone in the world has ironclad job security, you'd assume it would be the creator of a show that has produced dozens of comedy legends and has been renewed nearly 50 seasons in a row without fail. That's like a golden goose laying 2 hours of live comedy once a week for 5 decades. Just put food in his bowl and see what comes out. But in the 2007 documentary, Saturday Night Live in the 90s, Pop Culture Nation, SNL producer and creator Lorne Michaels indicated that the struggles of the 94-95 season almost cost him his job. Critics at the time called SNL dysfunctional and embarrassing, and their assessment was backed up by ever-declining ratings. NBC executive Don Ohlmeyer, who was president of the network's West Coast division at the time, later recalled giving Michaels an ultimatum. Apparently, his exact words were, "The show has to get better. You're a captain of industry, and that's the advice you give?" I guess that's why I'm not a captain of industry. Michaels, for his part, was scared. He knew he was in danger of being broke and washed up. As a result, he took a drastic approach to revamping the show, including several casting shakeups and a legitimate Saturday night massacre at the end of the season that left many of the show's major performers suddenly out of a job. But we'll get to that in a minute. In addition to the poor reviews and sliding ratings, the 1994-95 season, SNL's 20th year on the air, began on an uncertain note. The off-season exits of Phil Hartman, Julia Sweeney, and Rob Schneider had left some big shoes to fill, especially Hartman's. The famed actor and comedian joined the show in 1986 and became one of its most celebrated performers. During his 8-season run, his impressive range allowed him to take on all kinds of characters, including the vital role of then-President Bill Clinton. If you're doing a weekly comedy show that regularly skewers pop culture in the media, you kind of need someone who does a good impression of the president. Otherwise, you end up with whatever the hell this was.
If you want it, pass it. Whatever, I'll sign it. It's your call. I really don't care anymore.
SNL even acknowledged his absence in the first sketch of the 1994 season, which featured numerous cast members, including newbie Chris Elliott, auditioning to be the next on-screen Clinton. Julia Sweeney was candid about her decision to leave, stating, "Everybody says the show is a boys' club, right? Well, it's everything you think it is, times 100. Schneider would later recall that while he had a great experience at SNL, he simply wanted to take on other projects. For him, SNL was but a stepping stone on the path to Judge Dredd and Deuce Bigalow, European Gigolo. With the exit of Hartman, Sweeney, Schneider, and others, Lorne Michaels brought in emerging new talent like Chris Elliott and Janeane Garofalo. If you just said, "Hey, I didn't know Janeane Garofalo was on SNL," you're not alone. She didn't stay with the show for very long. She struggled throughout the season, feeling the characters she was given were unenlightened and stereotypical. Not to mention, they received relatively few lines. This was a typical experience for newcomers. Veteran cast members got the most airtime, with competing personalities draining SNL of its energy. Observers indicated that the writers' room was mired in a mood of depressed and lethargic burnout. One SNL writer even noted that the cast members couldn't even fake forcing themselves to care. According to the writer, when you watch the show on TV, that comes through. It's sort of like a screw you to the audience. We don't have to be good, because we're Saturday Night Live. Garofalo compared her first few months on SNL to a fraternity hazing. While she felt the experience was ultimately beneficial because it toughened her up, she also admitted it took its toll. She reportedly told friends being on SNL was the most miserable experience of her life, attributing her survival to cigarettes and Stoli. That sounds like a lot of people's jobs, except the booze is even cheaper. Garofalo left SNL in March of '95, weeks before the season officially ended. And she wasn't the only cast member to abandon ship before the final episode. Mike Myers left the show in January to begin his career making millions of dollars off of Austin Powers and Shrek sequels. Although at the time, Myers was still struggling to find footing as a movie star. The addition of new cast members Molly Shannon and Morwenna Banks during the season helped carry the weight of his departure. But that did not make the mid-season exit of one of the show's most recognizable performers any less conspicuous. At the time, Myers called his experience on the show a cross between Love Boat and Das Boot. Ouch. Although, to be honest, Captain Stubing on a German U-boat? That sounds like a fair sketch. Laura Keitlinger, a new addition to SNL that year, had previous writing experience working on the sitcom Roseanne. But the experience of working on SNL's 20th season was very different. She later said, "In the writer's room at Roseanne, you could on each other and everybody would laugh. But at SNL, it gets personal in a hurry." While cast members were also expected to contribute as writers, there was a disconnect between who would and would not have sketches appear on the show. Chris Elliott found that the pressure to write and perform could be bothersome, noting, "If you wanted to get on the air, you had to write some material for yourself." That mercenary approach to writing the show only amplified tension and resentment behind the scenes. Okay. This sketch is about a guy named Chris Elliott trying to get 5 minutes on a comedy show. It writes itself. Norm Macdonald climbed into the Weekend Update anchor's chair for the first time on September 24, 1994. And while he would become one of the segment's best-loved hosts, he was antagonistic, both on and off-screen. His habit of smoking in the writer's room prompted fellow writer Ian Maxtone Graham to shoot a water gun into his face to extinguish the cigarette. Macdonald retaliated by punching Maxtone Graham in the head. If only he'd been as critical of some of the jokes in Dirty Work. Macdonald's dark humor and dry delivery didn't thrill network executives either. He and SNL head writer Jim Downey were targeted by NBC executive Don Ohlmeyer, who didn't appreciate the pair regularly skewering O.J. Simpson and his upcoming murder trial on Weekend Update. Why so much sympathy for the juice? Simpson was one of Ohlmeyer's personal friends. In the end, Ohlmeyer got Downey fired, although he later returned to the show, and Macdonald was ultimately let go during the 1997-1998 season. Lorne Michaels opined that the tensions and animosities were natural. He noted writers may have been dismayed at the fortunes amassed by some performers once they left the show, while acknowledging that the show was apparently being looked upon, even by some of its cast and creative team, the way the network regarded it, as an ATM rather than a learning experience or a creative challenge. You mean like a creative challenge like the Coneheads movie, produced by Lorne Michaels? One former cast member, quoted in a New York Magazine article published during that beleaguered 20th season, felt Michaels intentionally kept the cast feeling ill at ease, likening it to the same techniques cults use. They keep you up for hours. They never let you know that you're okay. They always make you think that your spot could be taken at any moment by someone else. Wow, I just realized I've been in a lot of cults. As morale and ratings declined during the 94-95 season, some of the show's personnel noticed the writing beginning to suffer as well. Bonnie and Terry Turner, who had penned famous sketches like Wayne's World and The Church Lady, commented on the bizarre nature of some of the season's segments. Meanwhile, sketches like Gay Stripper Theater didn't thrill Garofalo, who commented that homophobic jokes were considered incredibly funny. She also wasn't pleased by an Alien skit that included anal probes and the word bitch written across male cast members' chests in lipstick. Garofalo later said she wanted to quit after the first week. Most of the show's viewers at the time clearly felt the same way. However, there were many bright points during the season. Future United States Senator Al Franken continued to appear as Stuart Smalley. Chris Farley's motivational speaker, Matt Foley, remained popular. And The Gap Girls, starring Farley, Adam Sandler, and David Spade as vapid teen girls working at the mall, became a new favorite. Perpetual SNL cast member Tim Meadows saw the 1994-1995 season as the worst year, in large part because there were too many people. From Meadows' perspective, the writers and cast didn't gel, and to him, it seemed like there were 30 people trying to race to the finish line. Meadows, one of the few cast members who survived the culling that took place before the 21st season, wasn't alone in his assessment. Chris Elliott also felt there were too many people in the cast, recalling that he would attend tapings only to appear in a single sketch. However, the show's crowded cast wasn't an issue for much longer. In a move still not completely understood by many of those involved, Lorne Michaels culled SNL's cast at the end of the 20th season, releasing some of its most beloved performers. Chris Farley, Adam Sandler, Ellen Cleghorn, Chris Elliott, Laura Keitlinger, Michael McCann, Jay Moore, and Kevin Nealon were all dismissed. Elliott and Keitlinger had only been on the show for one season, while another cast member, Morwenna Banks, was only on for a portion of the 1994-95 season. In interviews since his dismissal, Sandler has indicated that while he was hurt by the dismissal, it was as much him quitting as a true firing. According to Sandler, we kind of quit at the same time as being fired. It was the end of the run for us, and hurt a lot at the time because we were young and didn't know where we were going. But it all worked out. Well, it certainly worked out for Adam anyway. The following season, Michaels brought in a new lineup of talent, like Nancy Walls, David Koechner, Chris Kattan, Sherry O'Terry, some guy named Will Ferrell. As is so often the case with classics, the 94-95 season of SNL is fun to watch, but was decidedly not fun to make. Comedy is a serious business.
Saturday Night Live has never been afraid to be controversial. In fact, since the very beginning, controversy has been a big part of the show's brand. But over the nearly 50 years they've been on the air, some of those controversies have become bigger than the show intended, resulting in pulled sketches, public apologies, and permanent guest bans. So, today we're taking a look at the biggest controversies in the history of Saturday Night Live. This may be pre-recorded, but you can pretend it's live if you'd like. You couldn't ask for a better last musical guest of the 1970s than David Bowie. Viewers were psyched, but behind the scenes, Bowie was annoyed by NBC's decision to censor a verse in his song Boys Keep Swinging, which says, "When you're a boy, other boys check you out." Not being the kind of guy who enjoyed faceless TV executives meddling with his art, Bowie took action. While performing the song, he wore what can only be described as a giant marionette suit over the front of his body. At the end of the song, what appeared to be a giant, member, but was actually just a rolled-up party blower, emerged from the marionette's pants and began flailing around. We imagine at that point, NBC wished it had just left well enough alone. Led by Lee Ving, the guy who played Mr. Body in Clue, the punk band Fear was famous for their wild live shows where they would attack their own audience with sexist and homophobic slurs. John Belushi was a big fan, and he pulled some strings to make them the musical guests for the Halloween episode of 1981. Ving took the opportunity to taunt the New York crowd by saying, "It's great to be in New Jersey," and later chanting, "New York sucks." The band's set was cut short after a mosh pit on stage got out of control, but the real damage came after the cameras shut off, when Fear and their fans reportedly caused $200,000 worth of damage to the studio. Surprising no one, the band was permanently banned from SNL. It may seem silly now, but on October 15, 1988, SNL's Nude Beach skit, written by then SNL writer Conan O'Brien and featuring host Matthew Broderick, was hella controversial. Why? Well, the skit found Broderick visiting his first nude beach with a friend. After meeting some fellow beachgoers, the men comment on the size of Broderick's member, ultimately using the word penis over 40 times in the 4-minute sketch, an average of more than once every 6 seconds. That's a lot of wang. The skit generated thousands of written complaints at the time it aired. However, unlike some of the other segments in this episode, the sketch is still easy to find online. NBC apparently didn't feel the need to hide this nude beach from the public. Back in the 1990s, stand-up comic Andrew Dice Clay was white hot and at the top of his fame. But his material was controversial. Clay portrayed a misogynistic, homophobic jerk on stage, but his critics argued it was difficult to tell whether he was truly playing a character or just engaging in hate speech. The fact that he was hosting SNL on May 12, 1990 created a backlash even before the episode aired. Cast member Nora Dunn decided she didn't want to engage with Clay's comedy, whether it was a character or not, and she refused to appear in the episode. Dunn's decision was met with both support and derision, but NBC at least partly shared her concerns. The network required a rare 5 to 7 second delay on the live program, just in case the Dice Man went off script. But to his credit, Dice was a game host, and he performed without incident, poking fun at both his image and the controversy. Easily the biggest controversy to ever befall SNL came on October 3rd, 1992. Sinead O'Connor was the musical guest, and at the last moment, before dress rehearsal, she announced that rather than her originally planned set, she instead wanted to sing an a cappella version of Bob Marley's War. Her goal, she said, was to bring attention to child abuse, so she asked that a camera zoom in on her hands at the end of the performance to show a photograph of children. Dress rehearsal went smoothly, and the ending photo packed an emotional punch. When the time came for the live show, the crew followed the same routine, but this time, O'Connor didn't have a photo of children. This time, she held a photo of Pope John Paul II. She then tore up the photo while saying, "Fight the real enemy." No one applauded, and even backstage, O'Connor later recounted that everyone, including her manager, had fled in order to avoid her. On December 5th, 1992, during the popular Wayne's World sketch, Mike Myers and Dana Carvey presented a list of the most exciting things about Bill Clinton winning the presidential election. Among those was the president's 12-year-old daughter, Chelsea, whom they described as a babe in waiting. It was weird. The backlash was swift, and the inappropriate joke was edited out of the show's rebroadcasts. Even today, the clip of the joke is currently unavailable in NBC's vault of SNL footage. As a comic who wasn't afraid to push the limits of good taste, Martin Lawrence wasn't a guy you really wanted going off script. That, however, didn't stop him from deciding to try out some new jokes during the taping of his SNL monologue on February 19, 1994. The new material was mostly about John Bobbitt, whose unique assault by his wife Lorena made him common fodder for late-night hosts at the time. The rest of Lawrence's routine, however, was about his opinions on feminine hygiene, which went over less well. The worst parts of the monologue were edited out of repeats and replaced with an on-screen summary of what was said. Lawrence has never been invited back. In a moment that would live in YouTube infamy forever after, Oscar winner Adrian Brody spontaneously donned fake dreadlocks and attempted to speak Jamaican patois when introducing the musical guest reggae singer Sean Paul on the May 10, 2003 episode of SNL. It's what the kids call cringe. Brody said things like, "Respect all respect. My auntie. Respect all aspect. Respect me neck. Respect me knees. Big up Jamaica Massive. Big up Kingston Massive." And no, I'm not going to do the voice. The cast and crew could only watch in embarrassment, and Brody, not surprisingly, hasn't been back to host since. Life moves pretty fast. For example, on October 23, 2004, musical guest Ashley Simpson sang her first song, Pieces of Me, and it went well. Her second song, however, was a different story. Simpson was set to perform her song Autobiography, but instead the music for Pieces of Me came over the speakers once again. Her band tried to recover by quickly shifting to Pieces of Me, but then Simpson's pre-recorded voice also came through the speakers, and she obviously wasn't singing, leaving the audience wondering what in the Milli Vanilli was going on. Clearly embarrassed, Simpson did a little jig and then walked off stage. The moment received huge press coverage, and though Simpson insisted a doctor had instructed her not to sing due to a throat issue, her musical career never fully recovered. Jokes at the expense of people with disabilities used to be fairly common on television. But by 2007, that had rightly gone out of style, for the most part. But on February 24th of that year, SNL aired a sketch in which a character played by Bill Hader made a bizarre, off-color comment about his father, saying, "I remember we had this one great day at the park. We just had so much fun. He was running in the grass and chasing squirrels. They had this fountain and we threw pennies in it for hours. So great. It was the first day that I ever thought to myself, I have a dad, and not, I have a dad with Down syndrome." The audience laughed, but viewers at home quickly took offense, and the CEO and chair of the National Down Syndrome Society ultimately drafted a letter to producer Lorne Michaels excoriating him for the sketch. With the possible exception of a certain Oscar-nominated performance, it's rarely a good idea for white performers to work in blackface, as the practice has a long history steeped in racism. Nonetheless, on the March 11, 2000 episode of SNL, Jimmy Fallon donned dark makeup to impersonate his friend and fellow cast member Chris Rock. The sketch didn't make any major waves when it aired, but backlash arose in 2020 after the video resurfaced online. Fallon, by then the host of The Tonight Show, dedicated an episode of his show to apologizing for the incident. However, he has yet to apologize for the movie Taxi. When SNL announced Kanye West as their musical guest for the episode of September 29, 2018, some people assumed that the famously tempestuous star might stir up some controversy. Those people were correct. West refused to remove his pro-Trump MAGA hat, even after the crew specifically asked him to take it off. Then, after one of his songs, and during a commercial break, he remained on stage and gave a pro-Trump speech, which drew boos from the audience. He then gave a baffling performance dressed as a water bottle. All in all, some pretty strange stuff, even for Kanye. On the episode of October 7th, SNL decided to poke some fun at a well-known series of Safelite commercials by reimagining the helpful windshield repair technicians as top-shelf creeps. The sketch featured Beck Bennett as a Safelite technician purposefully breaking a customer's windshield in order to hit on her teenage daughter. Audiences were generally unenthused, and Safelite was understandably more than a little upset. NBC did its best to scrub the video from the internet and replaced the segment in reruns with a previously unaired sketch. Making fun of a person's disability isn't a great look for a comedian, but it's doubly bad when the person also happens to be a veteran. During the Weekend Update segment of November 3rd, 2018, Pete Davidson played a character who was very uninformed about the then upcoming election. In response to a photo of the congressional candidate Dan Crenshaw, who wears an eye patch, Davidson joked, "You may be surprised to hear that he's a congressional candidate from Texas and not a hitman in a porno movie. I'm sorry, I know he lost his eye in war or whatever." In the comedian's defense, he was playing an ignorant character, and the joke was meant to be on him. But the "lost his eye in war or whatever" comment was a bridge too far for most viewers, because Crenshaw is a Navy veteran who lost his eye in an explosion while serving in Afghanistan. It didn't sit well with many, and SNL quickly ran damage control by inviting Crenshaw on the show the following week to poke fun at Davidson and bury the hatchet. So, what do you think? Which of these controversies surprised you the most? And did you watch any of them live? Let us know in the comments below. And while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.